good afternoon. It's a Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and our distinguished guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lo- sorry, I'm nervous a little bit, Lockwood. Jonathan Lockwood, please welcome to the show.
Uh, yes. Oh, there we are, Sasha. No,
Yeah,
glad to be here. No, getting a little nervous pronouncing my name. It's only two syllables. Come on.
uh, Jonathan, I was thinking a lot about you in the last couple of days, especially with
Oh,
what's happened in this trip of Zelensky to United States and what's happened with Trump's comments, and it's everywhere, and we cannot ignore this
mhm.
at all. So I would like to know your opinion, how you view it.
Well, first of all, Mr. Zelensky was making an attempt, as far as I can tell, he was making an attempt when he made the visit and appeared with both uh, the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, as well as then following up Mr. Trump. Mr. Zelensky was trying to hedge his bets. That's he was trying to ensure that recognizing no doubt that the presidential election is very close. The indicators, as far as I can tell, are moving steadily in favor of Mr. Trump, so that it is somewhat more likely at this point, according to a number of observers, that Mr. Trump is in favor to win the presidential election. And also the Republicans are moving towards control of the Senate. But leaving only the possibility of the House of Representatives being a toss-up or very close. Now, given these things, Mr. Zelensky was no doubt thinking, I have to be nice to both sides. I cannot be clearly perceived as favoring one side over the other. Now, because of the way it was perceived initially, that there were some sort of implied criticisms of the Trump ticket, of Trump and Vance and so forth, that this got interpreted by the press as showing that Zelensky was actually favoring Harris over Trump. Mr. Trump, quite naturally, would respond very forcefully to that. Yeah, and so he is the signaling that's going back and forth is that Mr. Zelensky has to be very careful not to be perceived as leaning too far in favor of Mr. Trump's opponent, but instead being willing enough he wants to maintain lines of communication. He does not want to be forced into the position, which would be rather unenviable, if he should be perceived as criticizing Mr. Trump too heavily, and Mr. Trump wins. Mr. Zelensky might be forced to start addressing President Trump as Lord and Master. Lord and Master, forgive me. I did not mean to offend you. Please do not feed us to the Russians. He does not want to be forced into that position.
But Jonathan, what exactly did he say prior to their meeting that would upset Trump so much or indicate that he is for Harris instead of being for Trump? What did he exactly say or did?
You would have to read it. You would have to read the remarks very carefully.
Yeah.
But since President Trump has been known to react very forcefully to anything he perceives as a criticism of him, either personally or professionally or politically, Mr. Zelensky may have erred a little bit too incautiously in reaching out to or appearing with Kamala Harris or his campaign. And Trump is likely to see any kind of appearance as being opposition to him. So this may have been shall we say, a diplomatic error on Mr. Zelensky's part, but not a diplomatic error that is irretrievable. So he does have an opportunity to backtrack. And so it's still very interesting to watch. But what this should tell the Ukrainian military and political leadership is that they now have this narrowing window of opportunity prior to the presidential election itself and it becoming locked in, so to speak. They have, remember I told you the opportunity for the Ukrainians to follow up on their successful counteroffensive into the Kursk region. they have an opportunity to follow that up with a second, another counteroffensive in another area, which would visibly and decisively tilt the operational balance in favor of Ukraine. The most obvious opportunity to do that follow-up punch would be in Crimea, to completely seal off Crimea and to use those strategic reserves, which Zelensky says they have mobilized. They have about 13 brigades, and some unknown number of those could be committed to an offensive to basically, once the reinforcement and logistical supply lines to Crimea have been cut, that they could follow that up with an offensive into Crimea and basically retake or be on verge of visibly retaking the Crimea once the Russian occupiers have had their supplies cut. So they still have this opportunity, and I will go out on a limb so far, even though I do not have direct personal knowledge of this. It is the logical thing that I'm trying to adopt the Ukrainian perspective. The logical thing that I would do if I perceive the political and strategic situation as it is now. Logically, they have this narrowing window of opportunity before the winter weather renders any such offensive actions impossible. They have this narrowing window of opportunity to use their available resources in an imaginative and innovative way to create an operational defeat for Russia in a visibly and politically unmistakable way. So it's to give them an even stronger negotiating position or stronger means of leverage for creating a peace if Mr. Trump should be elected this November, that Ukraine would be in the strongest possible position to negotiate a peace favorable to Ukraine. Now, it's because Mr. Trump may not fully appreciate the Russian unwillingness to accept any negotiated peace on terms less than total surrender of Ukraine, which are the signals, by the way, which the Russians have been sending. They are not interested in a half a loaf. They want the entire loaf, and they think they can intimidate their way into getting it. So first, for its part, Ukraine must inflict that operational defeat upon Russian forces. That's the only thing that's really under their control. And then they must follow that up with renewed, behind the scenes, if necessary, diplomatic efforts with the United States, particularly once they see the results of the November elections, to shore up their political support not only with the United States but with its NATO allies, in order to be able to secure that peace on Ukraine's terms. But anything right now at this point, and it's quite possible, by the way, that President Trump, behind the scenes, once he sees that Ukraine has inflicted this operational defeat, he can change his mind. He can say, okay, remember that suggestion we discussed in the last program about that thing we discussed about the fact that the United States has these Vulcan anti-aircraft weapon systems, 20-millimeter anti-aircraft weapon systems, which are all in mothballs right now, because the Vulcans because they're kind of the equivalent of the Soviet or Russian ZSU 23-4s.
Mm-hmm.
That anti-aircraft system, same type of system. The Vulcans can fire 1,000, have two rates of fire: 1,000 rounds per minute. That's 20-millimeter shell. That's 1,000 20-millimeter shells coming at you per minute, to a high rate of fire of 3,000 rounds per minute. And I had, like as I mentioned, I had the opportunity to personally fire one of those things at a set of simulated ground targets.
So you can ask Russians, do you want 1,000 per minute or 3,000?
I mean, do you want to get chopped into mincemeat slowly or quickly?
Very quickly.
It just, and keep in mind, even the 50 caliber machine guns from World War II, the Germans saw enough about 50 caliber machine guns to keep their heads down, because they saw those 50 caliber machine guns chopping down trees. And imagine one of those bullets striking you cuts your body in half. So the 20-millimeter Vulcans are even much more effective. It's like a giant sickle of death sweeping across the battlefield. And let's just speak theoretically, behind the scenes, let's say President Trump is elected, and at the end, behind the scenes, and the Department of Defense says to the president, Mr. President, if you want to give something Ukraine, something that's low tech that's in our inventory, that would nevertheless put even more pressure on Russia. They see using military power to create even more unfavorable conditions for a Russian offensive, and therefore, and increase their casualty rates are already pretty much intolerable. It's only a matter of time whether they're going to totally exhaust their offensive capability, because they do not have the numbers or the mobilization potential that they had during World War II. World War II, they were able to mobilize much greater numbers, obviously, because they had a much greater population from which to draw. Now they've gone through all of their high-quality troops. Now they're going through conscripts. And so they cannot really, by definition, have that much more high-quality manpower to funnel into an offensive. So if they do, go ahead.
They adjusted their economy to war economy 100% during Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
It's not happening today. They do produce a lot of weapons or so on, but they're all second-rated weapons, and a lot of businesses are continuing to operate more or less, and so on, and people don't understand what's in the future from them and so on. Jonathan, I remember we discussed several times as one of the possibilities is a Korean scenario.
A Korean style armistice.
Armistice, when both sides stay where they are today. Let's see, in 15 minutes, the shooting stops, and whoever there is at the end of the war.
That is also Sasha. That is also a distinct possibility, because President Trump, he wrote that book, The Art of the Deal. That was one of his first. I believe that was his first book. He loves to make a deal that is hopefully, if not totally acceptable to both sides, at least something that you have something to go on. No, he just I don't believe he has been fully acquainted with the Russian concept of the Russian translation of compromise, which is what deal making is all about. In the American concept of compromise, both sides gain something. They get not everything they want, but they get something. It's meeting the other person halfway.
In Russian language, compromise is highly negative word. If somebody
mutual surrender is the way it translates into English.
That's right.
Mutual surrender. Both sides lose something. Yeah. You're right. It is a negative confidence. And that is how the Russians would be inclined to interpret an armistice. It's an interesting question, because if they had an armistice where it stops right there, and it's not a lasting peace, but it's a ceasefire, they stop, and basically the Ukrainians they keep what they have, and the Russians, they kind of sort of keep what they have, but it could flare up at any moment.
Well, in time. They will lose all their possessions, even if that would be arranged. But Jonathan, one very important thing, I kind of looked into Korean War in more details. And I think we're forgetting about that before that peace was, or so-called armistice, was arranged, North Korea, they almost got all peninsula to themselves. Then South Korea fought back and almost take all.
Yeah. MacArthur launched that Incheon offensive at the middle of the peninsula, cut off the North Korean army, and basically the United Nations forces with MacArthur in command and the South Koreans, they invaded North Korea, and they got they took Pyongyang, and they had gotten it, and they were approaching the Chinese border. And unfortunately, MacArthur he overplayed his hand. He wanted to engage China, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued a statement saying that a war with China would be the wrong war at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and with the wrong enemy. The proper thing to have done at that time, once the United Nations forces and MacArthur had taken Pyongyang, and they were basically there's this narrow neck of land at the peninsula of North Korea. If they had formed a defensive line, stopped short of going towards the Yalu River, but just formed a defensive line across the narrowest neck of the North Korean peninsula, they could have formed a very solid defensive line, consolidated, and then negotiated a peace where what was left of the North Korean peninsula, North Korean state, would essentially be a demilitarized zone. And yes, you could have concluded an armistice or a very favorable peace without drawing the Chinese into the war. So yes, such a scenario is possible. And also, in an armistice situation, in the current Ukrainian war. In this current situation, if you had an armistice, it would not preclude the isolation of the Crimean Peninsula. Because right now the Crimean Peninsula is for Russia very, very close to being completely untenable and unsupportable. And which is again why it is imperative, just from my personal perspective, analyzing the situation and trying to place myself into the Ukrainian strategic situation and what choices they have, it is imperative that if the Ukrainians can put together, they will, obviously it's a risk, but they do have according to the latest reports on the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainians are continuing to expand their occupation of Russian territory. And the Russians really aren't able to respond to that. So this should be a signal to the Ukrainian military and political leadership that if they commit their strategic reserves in a surprise counteroffensive to seal off Crimea, that would bear fruit. The Russians would not be able to react to it effectively, and that the Ukrainians could, in effect, by the time of the presidential election even, have sealed off the Crimea and have it fall back under control of the Ukrainian government. And that would that basically all that would leave the Russians with is the parts of those 4 oblasts in the east, those that they're trying to occupy. That's not significant. It's really not worth it, especially if Ukraine still has that large portion of Kursk occupied and is continuing to expand that. So the signals and the existing situation suggests to me, given the political situation in the United States, still very close presidential election, but moving in favor of Mr. Trump, and the Senate moving more likely towards Republican control, in there, and with the Republicans having, again, with the existing political factors as they are and moving in favor of the Republicans, giving the Republicans a decent shot at retaining control of the House of Representatives. That would mean a unified Republican government, potentially, as the result of this November's elections, something which very few people are talking about, except on the Republican side. They don't want to go ahead.
Please don't forget that the same situation happened when Trump won 2016 election. For 2 years, he had presidency, Senate, and House, everything. Then he started to lose one by one.
Yeah. And one of the problems was because Mr. Trump is not a professional politician, when he first came in, he did not, as they say, he did not clean house. He did not ensure that his political appointees were in charge, and he tended to leave too many people in charge that were from the Obama administration and therefore not particularly loyal to or willing to support his policy priorities. He is, from all indicators, he is going to avoid making that mistake again should he win the election. And the Republicans in both the House and Senate have also learned this particular lesson. And so if a unified Republican government takes place, then once they do decide, basically in this situation, the best thing that the Ukrainians can do to help themselves, and by extension all of Europe, is to launch that counteroffensive, find the way to do it in a way that is visible. They have to essentially duplicate what Robert E. Lee tried to do during the Civil War with his invasion at Antietam and his subsequent invasion at Gettysburg. Try to produce a decisive operational victory that would convince people, allies who are sitting on the sidelines, okay, it's safe for us to back them. It's safe for us to intervene. So now he has to do, Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky and his military commanders, they have to make a hard decision. They have in effect have to roll the dice again. They gambled and won and are winning with their Kursk offensive. They must now roll the dice again and gamble on, hopefully a calculated gamble, on achieving another operational victory that will tilt the situation decisively in their favor and create the conditions for a successful armistice, as you and I have discussed.
Wait a sec, Jonathan, if you imagine the map and you see the front lines and you see the Kursk, part of the Kursk Oblast, so how you arrange armistice with such a crazy front line? How you do it?
Well, not as neatly. You don't freeze the lines in place. That's where it's different. It's different from Korea, because in Korea you had it was pretty much a static front line, very right across the peninsula, right across the neck, the 53rd parallel.
Yeah.
And that one was comparatively easy to negotiate a full-scale armistice there. In this situation, the reason why Ukraine did this invasion of Kursk in the first is to have leverage, bargaining leverage, territory for territory. It says, okay, you pull out of our oblasts in the east, we will pull out of Kursk. We will create this demilitarized zone between us based on 1991 borders. You can essentially, Mr. Putin and his allies will say, okay, we are going to declare victory and go home.
Okay, Jonathan, in that scenario,
they're good at lying.
but Ukrainians would be wise to go on offensive and make more territories. Belgorod Oblast, then Voronezh, then Bryansk, then what else is Rostov, even, and so on. And they say, okay, there is an armistice. So you get out of all our territories, and we will give you back everything except Kursk and Belgorod, but all others we are giving you back. But we're going to keep this.
but you get the idea. The idea is get more territory in order to create leverage for a reasonably favorable armistice, or at worst a status quo armistice, the way it was before the war started. And it would be even better, again, if the Ukrainian military commanders see the opportunity, using their strategic reserves, to cut off the Crimean Peninsula and force the surrender of the Russian occupiers. So much the better.
Yeah,
but this is what they have to control. They cannot rely or gamble upon the political outcome in the United States being one which they perceive would be more to their liking. They have to deal with what is, and they have to look at very carefully at the current trends in the United States. And a number of political, very, very few serious political commentators or observers are claiming that Kamala Harris has the momentum for victory in November. I mean, you get a few rabid people that are trying to convince you otherwise, but they are based upon things that have been coming out with various parties and sectors, such as the labor unions, the Teamsters, not endorsing either candidate. That has not happened. Well, that's it's been a very long time since that has happened. So that's a very unfavorable development for the Democrats. And so if you combine that with other things, and for example, a lot of the media keep saying, well, Kamala Harris is leading in the popular vote, the national popular vote.
That doesn't mean
it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because the United States does not elect its presidents or anybody else very few cases by popular vote. They declare presidents by the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was set up very specifically by the Founding Fathers to prevent what they referred to as the tyranny of the majority, to making it simply a case of appealing to mass popular vote. And they were very familiar with that possibility. So they created this unique creation of the Electoral College to make it impossible, or very, very close to impossible, to win an election simply on popular sentiment or popular vote. That's part of the checks and balances system, which is the genius of the American system. And also keep in mind, for example, one party says this is, that President Trump is a threat to our democracy. Well, what they leave out is that they carefully avoid saying the United States has never been a democracy. It has been, since its very founding, a constitutional republic, which is a unique creation. It is not a democracy, never has been, never will be. It is not a democracy because the Founding Fathers feared the creation or the emergence of the tyranny of the majority. So that is why the Electoral College is the all-important thing to be watching. And according to most professional observers and poll watchers, that President Trump has the advantage to win currently, and it is growing in the Electoral College, which is where the election will be decided. And if Mr. Zelensky might be well advised to have his advisors give him a crash course, or get some willing American professors to school him on how the Electoral College works, and that's what he should be watching. So, again, I perceive Mr. Zelensky's recent visit as his own effort, from his perspective, to hedge his bets, to try to be nice to both sides. He probably did not, just by judging by the result, he probably did not execute that perfectly. So he may have to smooth some ruffled feathers, particularly if President Trump wins re-election this November. But in the meantime, while that is going on, the Ukrainians should concentrate on the one thing they have under their control, and which they need to pick and choose their time to launch that second counteroffensive, which will tilt the visible results in their favor and create the conditions for, if not a negotiated peace, which would be a stretch given the Russian attitude, but at least create an armistice modeled somewhat after the Korean War. But it would have to have important modifications, given the fact that the Ukrainians are still succeeding in their Kursk counteroffensive, and they've got better than 1,000 square miles. Now, according to the latest report, 1,000 square miles of the Kursk Oblast. So they have leverage, and they're acquiring more weapons in combinations which we cannot completely foresee yet. But like I said, just to digress for a minute, if President Trump were to gain re-election and he were to be advised as, Mr. President, in the meantime, in the short run, in order to give the Russians some more incentive to negotiate and cut it and make a favorable deal, let's give the Ukrainians a number of those 20 millimeter Vulcans with those, and which would force up the rate of Russian casualties even higher.
Jonathan, I'll tell you, there are some things that make me very skeptical about this scenario. And I'll tell you why. We are talking about Ukraine, we are talking about United States, and we forgot somebody. We forgot about Russia. Russia cannot afford any peace, any armistice, anything at all, simply because, let's look at the day after. Okay, let's see, they stopped shooting. Here comes tomorrow. What Russia has tomorrow? Completely ruined economy, very upset people,
falling oil prices,
yes, they're falling day by day, by the way.
Yeah.
And, sanctions are still there. So they have to negotiate as part of the deal to remove sanctions. And I'm not sure if NATO, United States, will agree to that, because what is armistice? Is in 6 months, Russia will start a new attack against Ukraine, and nobody cannot guarantee. Ukraine was always concerned, okay, if we will do the peace, who will guarantee us that Russia will not start next attack in a few months or maybe in 2 years or so? Nobody. That's very clear answer. And the Ukrainians have to accept it. Nobody can guarantee anything. So if they want to do the peace, they have to understand that the next 3 months they can be attacked again. So they have to start immediately preparing for this attack. So this peace is, I wouldn't even call it a peace, I would call it some kind of a pause.
It's a pause.
It's a pause.
A negotiated pause.
So Russia, of course, Ukraine would be glad to have some kind of peace and start rebuilding the country, build a new economy, join NATO, join the European Union, become a normal country. Russia is not going in very short period of time to become a normal country. Its size doesn't permit it to be a normal country. They have to be sooner or later, I'm pretty sure they will be divided in 8, 9, maybe even more different countries or oblasti or whatever they may call it. And then some of them could become in time normal countries. Maybe even Moscow will become a normal country, but without Putin and the president.
Or either that or become a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe China.
You notice that you notice that Chinese have been redrawing their maps, claiming more and more of what ostensibly is Russian territory, but
they have even these places like Vladivostok. They now have Chinese sound names, which have, and they, of course, in their
Chinese are not very subtly signaling what their intentions are, but
that's right. Now, of course, okay, we'll discuss it our next program, because there are some changes in Iran politics and so on, and I'm following that up. It's maybe too early to come to conclusions, but at least something interesting is happening. In the meantime, Jonathan, thank you so much for today program, and have a great weekend. And
you do the same.
And we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time. Bye, everybody. Glory to Ukraine.